For 8 years, one face was inescapable if you turned on the CW on a Thursday night. Ian Somerhalder played Damon Salvatore, the brooding, funny, dangerous vampire who anchored the Vampire Diaries from 2009 to 2017 and turned a modest supernatural drama into a global fandom. Then, almost overnight by Hollywood standards, he was gone. No late-night talk show circuit. No Marvel cameo. No prestige limited series designed to reintroduce him to audiences the way departing stars usually get repackaged. He simply stepped back. For years, fans filled comment sections with the same question: where did Ian Somerhalder go, and why did he never come back? The answer, it turns out, isn't mysterious at all. Somerhalder has spent the last several months explaining it himself in detail on a podcast. And the story he tells is not about being blacklisted or forgotten. It's about one show, one fight, and one decision that changed the entire shape of his life. By the time the Vampire Diaries ended in 2017, Somerhalder had spent nearly a decade being defined by a single character. That is a strange kind of success. It builds a devoted audience, but it also builds a box. Everyone in the industry, and a huge share of the public, associates you with one voice, one look, one energy. So when Somerhalder went looking for his next project, he didn't chase another vampire lead. He signed on to executive produce and star in V-Wars, a Netflix series based on an IDW comic, playing Dr. Luther Swan, a scientist, not a predator, thrown into a viral outbreak that turns ordinary people into something monstrous. He's been direct about why that role mattered to him. He wanted to be seen as himself, not as a fanged archetype recycled under a new title. On paper, it was a smart pivot. It kept him inside a genre his fans already loved while letting him occupy a completely different role inside it, the man trying to stop the outbreak, not cause it. Netflix ordered 10 episodes. Production got underway in 2018, with Adrian Holmes, Jackie Lai, and Peter Outerbridge joining the cast. Somerhalder has since described just how much he personally put into it. He relocated his family to Northern Ontario for the shoot and stayed immersed in the production for close to a year. That's not the commitment level of an actor picking up a paycheck between projects. That's someone treating the show as a second act he intended to build a career on. Here's where the story stops sounding like a normal TV production and starts sounding like something closer to a crisis. According to Somerhalder, when the first assembled version of V-Wars was delivered, it wasn't just disappointing. He said flatly that it wasn't watchable. He told the studio he did not want his name attached to it in that state. That's an extraordinary thing for a lead actor and executive producer to say about his own show right before release. Most performers swallow their doubts, do the press tour, and let the chips fall. Somerhalder instead pushed back, hard. He and his producing partner, James Gibb, asked Netflix for the creative control and the resources to fix it. Netflix agreed to hand over creative control, but wouldn't put up additional money to pay for it. So, by his own account, Somerhalder and Gibb raised more than $6 million themselves and used it to reshoot the material, compressing what would normally be a much longer process into roughly 6 days of filming, 10 to 12 hours of new footage. He has said the physical toll of that stretch was severe enough that he ended up in the hospital from overworking his body. Whatever you think of reshoot culture in television, that is not a story about an actor mailing in a season. That's a story about someone spending his own money and his own health trying to save something he believed in. V-Wars premiered on Netflix in December 2019. According to Somerhalder, it actually performed well. And then, a few months later, in March 2020, Netflix cancelled it after a single season. He's since said that internal disagreement among executives played a role, that people above him were fighting over the show's future, and somewhere in that fight, someone made the call to end it. In his retelling, Netflix's own message back to him was essentially, "This shouldn't have happened, but reversing it now would set a bad precedent, so the show is done." If that account is accurate, it's a uniquely bitter kind of cancellation. It isn't the numbers didn't work. It's a show that reportedly succeeded, killed by a decision Somerhalder didn't see as tied to the audience at all. He had already given the project nearly a year of his family's life, $6+ million of his own money, and, by his telling, a hospital stay. And then it ended anyway, for reasons that had nothing to do with whether people were watching. That is the moment Somerhalder points to as the real turning point. Not the years on the Vampire Diaries. Not general burnout. This specific experience. His described standing in front of a mirror, talking to his wife, and essentially doing the math on what the industry was asking of him versus what it was willing to guarantee him in return. He was around 40 at the time. He didn't want to spend another 1 or 2 years of his life working that hard, largely unpaid, by his account, only to have the outcome decided by people whose stakes in the project were nothing like his own. So, in his words, he pulled the plug on his own acting career. Not because Hollywood pushed him out. Because he chose to walk before it could do it to him again. It's worth pausing on why this account lands differently than the usual star steps back to focus on family narrative that publicists hand out every year. Most of those stories are vague by design, a soft, unbothered non-explanation meant to close the subject without giving anyone anything to dig into. What Somerhalder has described is the opposite. Specific dollar figures, specific timelines, a specific dispute with a specific streaming platform, and a specific physical breakdown. His naming what happened rather than gesturing at fatigue in the abstract. That specificity also reframes what walking away from Hollywood even means for someone in his position. He wasn't quitting because the phone stopped ringing. By most accounts, V-Wars performed reasonably well and he had real leverage. Enough leverage that Netflix handed him creative control rather than simply firing him or letting the show die quietly. He walked away from a position of some strength, not desperation. That's a much less common story than the industry likes to tell about itself, and it's probably part of why it resonates. It isn't a cautionary tale about failure. It's a story about someone succeeding by the metrics that were supposed to matter and discovering that success still wasn't enough to protect the thing he'd built. To understand why V-Wars hit as hard as it apparently did, it helps to look at what came before it. The Vampire Diaries wasn't a small commitment. Somerhalder played Damon Salvatore across 172 episodes over 8 seasons, one of the longest starring runs in modern genre television. That kind of run makes you rich and famous, but it also consumes most of your adult life on a single production schedule. Long shooting days, promotional obligations, fan conventions, a character whose popularity becomes inseparable from your own public identity. By the time the show ended, Somerhalder had spent nearly a decade being professionally identified as one person's face and voice. Going straight from that into V-Wars, another year-plus commitment, another relocation, another all-consuming production, meant he entered his 40s having barely had a real gap between two enormous professional obligations. When the second one blew up in the specific way it did, with money and health on the line and the outcome still decided by executives he had no real power over, it apparently clarified something for him that 8 years on the Vampire Diaries hadn't. Fame and a loyal audience were not the same thing as control. He had both of the former in abundance. He discovered he had almost none of the latter. Somerhalder didn't disappear into total privacy after V-Wars. He redirected his public energy rather than switching it off entirely. The most visible piece of that redirection is Brothers Bond, the bourbon company he launched in 2021 with his Vampire Diaries co-star Paul Wesley. It's a notable choice. Rather than distancing himself from the show that made him famous, he built a business that leans into the real friendship behind Damon and Stefan Salvatore's on-screen bond, while giving him something acting never could, ownership. Brothers Bond has grown steadily since launch, expanding its lineup and, according to industry coverage, doing multi-million-dollar business within a few years. In 2025, the brand introduced a bourbon made from regenerative grain, tying the product directly into the environmental theme Somerhalder had already been talking about publicly for years, with a public commitment to help push regenerative farming practices across tens of millions of acres of U.S. farmland by the end of the decade. That environmental thread runs through nearly everything he's done since leaving acting. Somerhalder has been vocal about soil health and regenerative agriculture going back well before V-Wars, including involvement with the documentaries Kiss the Ground and its follow-up Common Ground, both built around the idea that restoring soil health is a meaningful piece of addressing climate change. That's not a hobby he picked up to fill time after quitting acting, it's a cause he was already attached to, which suggests his post-Hollywood life wasn't invented from scratch. It was already partly under construction while he was still on television. The other major piece of Somerhalder's life after Hollywood is the home he's built with his wife, actress Nikki Reed, whom he married in 2015. Reed has her own experience with franchise-level fame from the Twilight films, which likely made her an unusually well-matched partner for someone recalibrating his relationship with celebrity. She wasn't approaching his decision as an outsider, but as someone who had lived through a comparable version of it herself. The two have spoken about relocating to a working farm outside Los Angeles, where they raised their 2 children, Body Soleil, born in 2017, and a second child born in 2023, alongside a large number of animals. Reed has described the move to rural life as a deliberate choice made during a period when she wanted to give her family a more grounded, normal existence away from the pace of the industry, and has called the shift to farm life something close to a relief. Somerhalder has talked about the physical work of the farm in fairly unglamorous terms, describing it as genuinely demanding, hands-on labor, not a lifestyle photo shoot. He and Reed have framed their household values around the same regenerative language that shows up in Brothers Bond's marketing, not just sustaining what exists, but actively rebuilding soil, land, and food systems. Whether or not you find that framing compelling, it's consistent. The language he uses to describe his business matches the language he uses to describe his home life, which suggests it isn't just branding. If there's a single thread tying all of this together, it's the distinction between two very different ways of building a public career: waiting for permission or building ownership. As an actor, even a hugely successful one carrying a hit show for 8 seasons, Somerhalder was, by definition, waiting for permission. Permission from a network to keep a show running. Permission from a streamer to greenlight a second season. Permission from executives, whose incentives had nothing to do with his own investment of time, money, or health, to decide whether a project he'd poured a year of his life into would even see daylight in its intended form. Brothers Bond flips that arrangement. As a co-founder rather than a hired lead, Somerhalder isn't asking anyone to renew him. The regenerative agriculture work operates on a similar logic. It isn't contingent on a casting director's opinion of him or a streaming platform's quarterly subscriber numbers. It's slower, less glamorous work by nature, tied to seasons and soil rather than release calendars, but it doesn't come with someone else holding a cancellation button. That doesn't mean the version of Ian Somerhalder that exists in 2026 has fully escaped risk or hard decision-making. Building companies and farmland partnerships carries its own uncertainty. But it's a different kind of uncertainty. It's uncertainty tied to markets and agriculture and business execution, not to a single executive's internal politics deciding, without explanation, that a show he'd nearly wrecked his health finishing simply wasn't going to get a second chance. None of this fully explains away why so many fans spent years assuming Somerhalder was simply between roles, waiting for the right script to lure him back. Part of that is just how attachment to a character works. Damon Salvatore was, for a lot of viewers, not just a performance. He was 8 years of appointment television, a character whose arc audiences followed as closely as they'd follow a real relationship. It's genuinely hard for a fanbase like that to accept that the actor behind the character might simply be finished with acting as a profession, rather than just quietly waiting for the industry to make him a good enough offer. But Somerhalder's own account doesn't support the waiting for the right offer theory. His described V-Wars as the moment he decided, deliberately, to stop building his life around whether television or streaming executives approved of his work. That's a different thing than taking a break. A break implies you're planning to come back once conditions improve. What is described sounds more like someone who looked at the actual terms of the deal: years of commitment, financial exposure, physical risk, and a total lack of control over the outcome, and decided the deal itself wasn't one he wanted anymore, independent of how good any future script might be. It's also worth noting that this isn't a story about bitterness toward the Vampire Diaries itself, or toward the people he worked with. His continued partnership with Paul Wesley on Brothers Bond, an active, growing business the two of them built together years after the show ended, suggests the opposite of a clean break from that chapter of his life. He didn't reject the relationships or the legacy. He rejected the operating model, the idea that his livelihood should keep depending on approval from people several levels removed from the actual work. Most actors who reach the level of visibility Somerhalder had after the Vampire Diaries do the opposite of what he did. They take the next role, and the one after that, largely because the alternative, stepping out of the conversation, feels professionally dangerous. There's a widely held belief in the industry that visibility itself is the asset, and that disappearing from screens for even a couple of years risks being forgotten entirely. Somerhalder's decision runs directly against that belief. He had, by any reasonable measure, more leverage after V-Wars than most actors ever get: a loyal global fanbase, a decade of hit television, real influence in salvaging a struggling production. And he used that leverage not to negotiate his next deal, but to exit the negotiating table altogether. That's the part of this story that's genuinely a little unusual, even by the standards of celebrities who claim to be stepping back for family. Most of those exits are soft-pedaled, deliberately vague, designed to leave the door open. Somerhalder's version, at least as is told it recently, is specific enough: the dollar figures, the hospital stay, the internal Netflix politics, that it reads less like a graceful exit line and more like someone finally saying, on the record, what actually happened. None of this means Ian Somerhalder has ruled out ever acting again, and he hasn't framed it that way. What he has said, repeatedly and in detail, is that he's no longer willing to structure his life around an industry where someone with far less personal investment than his own can end a project he nearly destroyed his health finishing, for reasons that had nothing to do with the audience it was reaching. In the years since, he's put his name and his money behind things he actually controls: a bourbon company built on a real, long-running friendship, an environmental cause he's cared about since before he left the industry, and a farm he and his family run themselves, day to day, without waiting for anyone's approval. So when people ask why Ian Somerhalder vanished from Hollywood after the Vampire Diaries, the honest answer isn't that Hollywood forgot about him, and it isn't that audiences moved on. By his own account, it's that one project, the one meant to prove he could be more than the vampire everyone remembered him as, showed him exactly how little control even a successful, well-liked star actually has over his own work. And rather than spend the next decade hoping the next project would go differently, he decided to build a life where that particular kind of decision was never in someone else's hands again. What do you think? Was that the right call, or is there still a version of a comeback that could work for him? Let us know in the comments, and subscribe for more deep dives into the real stories behind the stars who stepped away from the spotlight.